Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by the GoldSilverBitcoin.com store. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Jimmy Song. I'm not sure if Jimmy needs an introduction. He is a co-author on Thank God for Bitcoin, a recent book examining the biblical implications of Bitcoin and how it can save the world from the corruption we see on a day-to-day basis. Jimmy, are you what kind of developer are you?
Full stack, everything. I've done everything from tweaking JavaScript to tweaking database queries. So yeah, pretty much done everything in my career. I've been a developer a long time.
Are there any topics in terms of Bitcoin that you've been keeping an eye on recently? Obviously, so much has happened in the last 2 years. Is there anything in this year or recent weeks that has caught your attention?
Yeah, so there's a lot of drama going around opctv, or check template verify, which is a covenants opcode that Jeremy Rubin has been pushing. There's a lot of drama around speedy trial and stuff like that, which which we can get into, but it's honestly like a little bit inside baseball, and a lot of people don't know too much about what covenants are or what they're meant to do. And I'm a little bit skeptical about the need for something like covenants, though, like if we do get them, I guess maybe we could live with it. But yeah, there are certain properties that I'm not sure I like, and there's a lot of community debate going around at the moment.
Let's get into that a bit later. I want to start with Thank God for Bitcoin, the recent book that you co-authored. Can you tell people what you set out to achieve when authoring this book, co-authoring?
Yeah, so the whole book started as like a COVID Bible study. We wanted to, get together and study Bitcoin, or study money from a biblical perspective. We did, and it was good. And at some point, the other people in the group expressed some interest in learning more of the Austrian economics and the economic argument for money and things like that. So we studied a couple of books. The first is The Ethics of Money Production by Guido von Holzmann, who's Catholic, I believe, and Honest Money by Gary North, who used to be an advisor to Ron Paul. He's written a lot of homeschooling curriculum. He unfortunately passed away a couple of months ago. But we read both books, and they were great because they talked about the monetary system and all of the different consequences of the fiat monetary system that we're in. The only thing we didn't like was the ending. The ending to both books was something like, we need to get a political action committee together and return the US to a gold standard, which, if you've paid attention to anything in politics over the last 50 years, it's like number 1 million on the list of priorities for either party. So we knew it wasn't going to happen. But we had this thing called Bitcoin that we wanted to show people, hey, like there is a way to opt out of the current system using Bitcoin. And you didn't have to get the whole country on a gold standard or anything like that. So that's where really the book came from. And it, like, the first 7 chapters don't even mention the word Bitcoin at all. It's all about the current monetary system and how it's corrupt, how it's really a form of theft, and how it developed, and all the consequences, and personal lives and interactions and companies and churches. And we build up to the argument of, hey, this system is awful and it's immoral. What can we do about it? And then we present Bitcoin as the solution. So that's how it came about. It's really a child of COVID, if you can think of it that way.
And not Bitcoin as an answer through nation states, but rather directly from the people, a connection to Bitcoin, correct?
Yeah, it's the big thing to know about Bitcoin is that it's decentralized, much like gold and silver. You have the ability to really own it. And it's a property right that's stronger than even physical possession. So, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Executive Order 6102 in 1933, which seized all gold from private citizens. You weren't allowed to own more than 1 ounce of gold. And at the time, you could convert $20.67 for 1 ounce of gold. A year later, FDR changed it so that it was $35 to an ounce of gold. So this was his way of expanding the monetary supply very quickly. That whole system was dependent on the fact that most of the gold was held in banks at the time. So he just went to the banks and said, hey, all your gold belongs to me now. And we'll give you these pieces of paper for it instead. And that was the big thing, was that having a physical location makes it very difficult for you to truly possess it, because somebody can come into your house and essentially take it away. With Bitcoin, you have this ability to own it like just in your brain, right? And you can like memorize seed phrases and things like that. And it's dependent on a secret that only you know. So if you don't want to, if you really want to stand up for your property, you don't have to give it up. And in fact, there are many instances of people that just kind of refuse to give up their keys, and therefore, authorities weren't able to seize them and so on. But that said, most people will give it up if their life is threatened or something like that. But it does give you a property right that's stronger than physical property. It's what my friend BJ Boyapati calls super property right. It's you can hold on to it and no one can sort of like rip it away from you. In that sense, it's much more like a belief than it is like physical property. Physical property, they just need to overtake you physically and then take it away. With Bitcoin, they have to overtake you mentally, and they, I guess torture is a way to do that, but generally, it's much more difficult to get somebody to give up their secrets inside their head.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. So this notion of super property, obviously property is one of the foundational concepts of civilization, Western civilization over the last several thousand years. And really actually more so in terms of how most people have experienced it in just the last few hundred years, 400 years. And so generally speaking, everything was property of kings, king gods who were apparently representatives of God, on down through the ages, different sort of manifestations of this leader figure in different societies. Today, best known in the form of president or prime minister. Now, super property is this notion that, in a way, as others have argued, Trace Mayer comes to mind, Bitcoin is, as you stated, a belief or even an idea or free speech. And now, where the difference is, I suppose, if you have gold somewhere, you can get tortured to so you have gold and you're getting tortured and you give up the location. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can memorize your password, your seed phrase as well. And the only way in which to, even if they were to find, say, a hardware wallet, a hot wallet, a cold wallet, would be, they would still need that password or for your compliance, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can hide gold, of course, but it still has a physical location. And honestly, like the number of physical locations is way smaller than the number of metaphysical locations that you can store your Bitcoin. You can think of it that way. The space of possible seed phrases is way, way larger than the number of atoms on Earth, for example. So it's way more secure in your brain than in a physical location, because there's only like the landmass is really large, and it's probably impractical for the police to go search for it. But if it's big enough, they might, and that's kind of the key. I will quibble with you a little bit, though, because in a sense, like during monarchies and stuff like that, you did have property rights. The thing that's really weird today is that we have this notion of public property where things are owned both by the people and the state or something like that. You have a public park, for example, it sort of belongs to you, but it doesn't. And this non-separation of property, or knowing who actually owns the property, is actually the problem. You have a lot of problems in different cities in the United States where homeless people are sleeping in these parks, and it's like, well, does it belong to them? Not exactly. It belongs to all of us, but if the government doesn't enforce it, then like there's nothing you can kind of do. It's that sort of thing which causes a lot of conflict. So in Austin here, we had a bunch of homeless people living in tents on the street like the whole time for a year or so, and that was a big problem because it wasn't clear whose property was, and this notion of public property is kind of an oxymoron if you think about it, because property is something that's proper to you. It comes from the Latin word propria, which is one's own. And the idea that it's one's own and universal is literally like a paradox or a contradiction. So in a monarchy, what you have is clear boundaries. The sovereign owns certain things, and the people own certain things. And this is one of the benefits of having clear property boundaries, is that when a sovereign says, hey, you go off to war, most people say, well, what are you going to pay me? Because it's not my war, it's your war. It's your property that you're risking, and so on. And they had a different incentive than, say, the presidents and prime ministers today, who basically want to rape and pillage the public property for their own ends, until and like leave it barren for the next person, something like that. So the notion of property is a very important concept, and having clear property boundaries, not like these weird rentals that we have in the current system, it's a very good thing, because when you own something, you tend to take care of it. And unfortunately, we have a lot of people that have temporary possession, so they want to abuse it as much as possible.
And I suppose this critique of public property also plays into what you highlight in the book, is that we live in an age of corruption.
Yeah, it is an age of corruption, because we have this thing called fiat money, which is a form of public property, but not really, because the people at the money printing spigot get all of the benefits. This is called the Cantillon effect, which is named after Richard Cantillon, who was an Irish French economist from like the early 1700s. And he noticed with the Bank of England, who was really the first central bank in the Western world, that when they print, the people closer to the money get all of the benefits, and to the money printing get all of the benefits, and people further away get screwed. And that's the case with our current fiat monetary system. The people that are closest to the money printer, namely banks and of all kinds, they get all of the benefits, and large companies too, because they get loans from these banks. But the people that get screwed are way down at the edges. So people in North Korea, for example, they're using dollars for their black market transactions. They're the ones that really get screwed. Their prices have doubled during COVID. And there's nothing they can do about it. And they don't have any voice in any of this stuff, which is terrible, because at least we theoretically have the right to, vote in a new president who will appoint a new Fed chairman who will tighten the monetary policy or something like that. But for someone in North Korea, they have no rights whatsoever, but they suffer just the same.
Now, we've been speaking a little bit. You mentioned a concept that I thought was very interesting, and something that could be hashed out more, is that Bitcoin is in a way a belief or a super property right. And I pulled up an article from Cointelegraph, and this discussion has been had since as long as I've been in this industry, in 2012. So probably even before that, probably even before Bitcoin existed, which essentially states that like code is speech, and therefore Bitcoin is just an expression of free speech. So to quote from Max Jakubowski, I believe is his last name, and I know Max, he's a good guy, in Cointelegraph, there is a concept that exists in the crypto space that effectively states Bitcoin is code, code is speech, and speech is protected under United States law. We asked the legal experts this. So the claims are based on arguments from before the days of Bitcoin, which posit software as free speech, and thus state that it should be protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. The topic was evidently first brought to public attention back in '99 when digital publisher Eric Corley went to court against Universal City Studios for publishing source code that decodes DVDs. Now, I believe the critique here is that essentially, or one argument here is that is from Neil Richards, and this is the critique of the software as free speech argument. Neil Richards is one of the world's leading experts in privacy and information law, as well as freedom of expression. And he argued in 2016 that code equals speech is a fallacy because it would needlessly treat writing the code for a malicious virus as equivalent to writing an editorial in the New York Times. Now, this discussion as code and software as free speech, this is a debate for the ages. Certainly, it's going to be had for hopefully centuries into the future. Now, I will critique what Richards is arguing here insofar as speech can also do, arguably, speech can do quite as much damage as a software virus. We can see leaders weaponize language. We can see we can see language be weaponized in general. So that's just kind of a short critique thereof. Do you have any, Jimmy, other thoughts on this notion of Bitcoin as a belief and Bitcoin as a, or even speech, but then as a developer, but even more so, I guess this also gets us to kind of the root of the discussion here is like Bitcoin as a belief that people can hold in order to improve the world?
Yeah, I don't know if so that whole line of argument depends on free speech being this this immutable ideal or something like that, and I don't think that's something that we should rest all of our beliefs on. So this is very popular among maybe the more left side of the political spectrum when they say stuff like, hey, code is speech and therefore it's all, it should all be allowed and so on. And they tend to sort of like fit almost everything into the speech moniker. It's like, well, Occupy Wall Street is a form of speech, or, hey, like protesting this is a form of speech, or, breaking someone's windows is a form of speech or something like that, which I don't know. It's kind of a brain twisting to me. I come from a more natural law tradition where, I decide what's right and wrong, not based on whether or not it, there on one principle of freedom of speech, but on natural law. Like on common sense, on what most people agree on, and that's I think the most stable form uh, of morality, and that's something that the founding fathers recognized. Natural law is a concept that's ancient, and goes back to, even way back to like Roman law, but certainly English common law and so on. And speech is one of the things that you would say is part of natural law. You should have the right to say what you want to say. I mean, given whatever property you happen to be on. I think it's Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises argue that, okay, if you're talking about freedom of speech, you have to talk about where you're saying it, right? Like, because you can't just come into my home and yell at me. That's not allowed because it's my property and I can do what I please with my property. But like if it's on a public street or something like that, it gets confusing because again, you have these weird property boundaries. It doesn't really belong to you. It doesn't really belong to me. It belongs to something like the state or something like all of us. So, we have to make this artificial thing. Everything I think comes down, like if you think about it in terms of natural law, it does come down to something like property rights. Where are you saying these things? If you're saying it on your on your own phone or something like that, then no one can prosecute for it. But if you're, spraying graffiti on somebody's building, yeah, you're defacing their property, and that's not speech. So I kind of reject this premise of freedom of speech as sort of like the pillar, the cornerstone on which all rights are built, which is kind of where this line of argument comes from. But rather, I rest my case for Bitcoin on natural law, which is that you should be able to own your property. And if someone takes it away from you, that's theft. And if somebody takes it from you through fraud, that's fraud. And those are, things that we can clearly identify as unjust things. And the people that perpetrate them should be punished for it. But, with regard to how you justify Bitcoin, I think it's pretty intuitive for people that if you own something, for someone to take it away is an evil thing. And if government justifies it by saying, oh, we need to prevent money laundering or child pornography or drugs or something like that, we know in some sense that they're being ridiculous, that they're really enforcing, they're being, that this is tyranny, that they're just like enforcing arbitrary rules because they don't like it, rather than it being about your rights. So for me, that's how I view Bitcoin. It's a property right. You don't have to go and justify it. It's self-evident that it is property and that it is something that we should be allowed to own. And it shouldn't be up for debate at all in any way, shape, or form.
To simplify, so you would argue that property is essentially far more important than free speech in terms of a foundation of a society or rights. Okay. And then, so I agree wholeheartedly. In your example, where somebody runs into a home, for example, that now is taken out of the realm of a speech legal question and directly squarely into the realm of property. Now, let's say you welcome someone into their home. And then there becomes all sorts of other types of boundary discussions to be had. And it's not just simply that you allow somebody onto your property, but there's also a sort of psychological, a relational dynamic and all sorts of boundaries that then have to be set out. So for instance, if you're staying at my house, well, you are able to stay in the guest room and use the common areas and in the bathroom that's been assigned to you, but you can't use the bathroom that's, upstairs in the master bedroom in our family bedroom, right? So there's all sorts of these different types of kind of like sub property discussions that can be had within this wider property discussion that I think has implications in our daily lives, and I wanted to make a note of. So on the topic of property and natural rights. Now, the two, according to an article in Cambridge that I'm pulling up right here, Jimmy, by Eric Mack, the two main theses of the natural right of property are that persons possess an original non-acquired right not to be precluded from making extra personal material their own, and that this right can and does take the form of a right that others abide by the rules of a practice of property, which facilitates persons making extra personal material their own. Now, in a article written by Eric Deschausson at William and Mary Law School, he discusses the ways in which Bitcoin functions as property law. So he writes in the abstract, quote, Bitcoin replicates many of the formal aspects of real estate transactions. Bitcoin transactions have features that closely resemble grantor names, grantee names, legal descriptions, and signatures found in real property deeds. While these, quote, Bitcoin deeds may be interesting, they are not profound. Bitcoin goes beyond creating these simple digital deeds, however, and replicates important institutional aspects of real estate transactions, in particular recordation and title assurance. Deeds to real property are recorded in a central repository, which is akin to the Public Records Office, which the parties and the public can search to determine title. When one grantor executes more than one deed covering the same property, recordation acts, race notice and race notice determine which grantee wins. Now, Jimmy, so why is this so fundamental for us to view Bitcoin as property? It seems that categorizing in legal terms Bitcoin as property seems to be the one in which most affords the individuals who may or may not have access to Bitcoins, hold Bitcoins, more rights to those Bitcoins. Any thoughts on that?
Well, the whole point of Bitcoin is that you can really own it. If you're holding it with a custodian, then you don't really own it. And this is the problem with dollars, is that if you hold dollars at a bank, they can seize it away from you at any time. And even if you have dollars in your pocket, they can inflate it away from you at any time. You don't really have property rights over your own money because the value of it may change at any moment. According to the dictates of central authority. The idea with Bitcoin is that you really can own it. There's no trusted third party that you have to trust. You just have to manage your own stuff. Now, that usually means that with great power comes great responsibility. So you have to take care of your stuff. You can easily lose it, and many people have. But that's the other side of the coin, is that if you really want to be your own bank, then you have to start securing your own stuff. But yeah, it's the property. Bitcoin is property, and I think that's the foundational, you know, thing in civilization that not a lot of people really understand. That, you know, when you have that as a foundation, when you have you know, property as a foundation, especially something as important as money, and you have the ability to really secure it, then it's thriving for civilization, because you can plan around it and so on, rather than always be sort of like anxious that somebody can take it away from you. And that lack of seizability by a third party is what gives it a lot of its power.
There's a quote by a gentleman named Leonard Reed. And he said, quote, "Thou shalt not steal. To know that stealing is wrong implies knowledge of an alternative that is right. To each his own," usually referred to as private ownership. The ancient taboo against stealing presupposes that an individual has a right to the fruits of his own labor. Recognizing as evil the taking of that which belongs to another certainly antedated the Decalogue by many centuries. There's every reason to believe that the observance of this taboo, this respect for the principle of private ownership, marked the dawn of civilization. Whether this "thou shalt not" is honored or breached primarily determines the rise or fall of civilization. True, "thou shalt not covet" is even more basic than, quote, "thou shalt not steal." If no one coveted the possessions of another, there would be no thievery. To refrain from stealing is the genesis of civilizations. Only 2 points need to be understood for this assertion to ring true. First, civilizations rise and fall with the rise and fall of individual freedom. Second, individual freedom rises and falls to the degree that private ownership, the absence of stealing, is respected and adhered to. Individual freedom is out of the question wherever and whenever private ownership does not prevail. Creative outbursts, the mark of civilization, bear a direct correlation with increase in individual freedom. The record speaks for itself, and I would categorize Bitcoin as one of these creative outbursts. The private ownership thesis rests fundamentally on the defensible assumption that one person has as much right to his life as any other. If an individual has a right to his life, it logically follows that he has an equal right to sustain his life. The sustenance of life being the fruit of one's own labor, or what can be attained for it in peaceful exchange. Livelihood is but the extension of life. Thus, to steal is to take life. Not to steal is to respect life. It is to endorse and to hold sacrosanct the institution of private ownership. It is self-evident that no civilization could be born without the observance of this tattoo. The institution of private ownership, to each his own, has spawned all civilizations. Were thievery the general practice, we would quickly descend into another dark age. A resort to law would be useless. The gendarmerie would be thieves. So, Jimmy, so now in your book, you propose Bitcoin as a solution to so many ills that have befallen this end of an age, really, in some ways. We've sort of been living in between two ages, and really from as some formulate this, an older civilization into a new civilization, a high-tech technocratic civilization, if you will. Now, how can we as individuals and as a society use Bitcoin in order to stave off this corruption and to preserve civilization and individual freedom? What does the book say about that?
Yeah, I mean, the book really talks about how fiat money debases not just currency, but civilization in general. You get an army of rent seekers. You get a lot of people that aren't producing anything or building anything. Instead, they're living off of the monetary spigot. And you know, yeah, like just practically speaking, ask any management consultant, you know, how much of a company can you eliminate without it hurting profits at all? And they'll usually tell you about 50% of any company. You can just get rid of those people. They're not really doing anything, and it wouldn't hurt anything within the company. And what's remarkable is that they still continue to employ all those people. So what's actually going on? Well, they're being essentially subsidized by the money printing. They could be running a lot more efficiently, but they don't, because they don't have to, and they instead have all sorts of compliance departments and things like that, which don't add anything to customer value. It's just like checking off some box for some bureaucrat or something like that. That is civilization debasing, because when you get enough of those people in a society, that breaks down civilization, because essentially all they're doing is stealing from everybody else. This is what happened to Rome. The debasement of currency led to the debasement of the civilization. There was a large class of people that were just essentially living on welfare in that state. The whole idea of bread and circuses comes from that era, where Roman emperors would have these massively entertaining gladiator battles, the circuses, and would hand out free bread. You can only sustain that for so long before the entire civilization collapses. And that's what happened to Rome. And I think we're headed in the same way. One question that I like to sort of ask people is what if we reach the peak of civilization in 1969, when man landed on the moon, right? Like that was a big deal. That was clearly like moving forward on the frontier or whatever. But if you think about it, what have we done since then? Well, we've made financial products that make it easier for people on Wall Street to make money. We've got navel-gazing, social media and communication devices that make it easy for us to look at other people's cat videos. But really, have we pushed forward on the frontier at all? Have we actually built civilization since then? And it's kind of a scary thought, and for good reason, because anytime an empire reaches its peak, it never thinks that it's on the way down. It just thinks that it's normal or stay steady. I suspect that in a fiat world, we would, in a completely fiat world without Bitcoin, we'd be headed down the toilet at the moment. And I'm sure some people that didn't have Bitcoin as part of the pandemic. At least in my observation, they lost a lot of hope. They aged a lot, and a lot of them had mental health problems and stuff like that. Why? Because there's nothing to look forward to. It's clear that civilization is going down in flames in many ways. But the Bitcoiners I know, they actually had hope, because this is actually a frontier that we can push. And this changes the equation and incentives so that people build again. There is no real rent seeking in Bitcoin. You have to build something. It's a meritocracy. You have to give something to the market that they want. So with fiat money, what you see is that the best and the brightest of every generation. So, the people graduating from Harvard and MIT and Stanford or wherever, they mostly go into investment banking or, Facebook or Google or something like that. They're not building civilization per se. They're either making money with huge leverage from Cantillon effects at an investment bank, or they're selling ads and clicks, right? Which are all navel gazing. We're like 100 years ago, these same people would have been, building new jet engines or, creating new modes of transport or figuring out a way to get into space or something like that. Instead, all those people are rent seeking. And that's the real tragedy, is that the human capital is being wasted, because really at the end of the day, that's all we have. And it's really through the ingenuity of people and ideas and entrepreneurs that we get the civilization buildup that we have. And it's enormously efficient. And it supports a ton of rent seekers at the moment. But if we don't correct this soon and have a harder money and repurpose a lot of these rent seekers towards actual civilization building, we're in for a pretty big collapse.
We see the effects of the money printing now on the Main Street in the US in terms of inflation. And as Henry Hazlitt points out, money printing and inflation leads to reckless spending. And as you argue in the book, Bitcoin would precede a disciplined spending habit, not only at the nation state level, but also at the level of individuals. I think we would spend more reasonably if we didn't have if we weren't awash in cash, essentially, for doing service type work. As you mentioned, the a lot of the advents that you noted, social media, the internet, have their beginnings, I think, in the 60s or even before, leading up into man landing on the moon. So your question of what have we achieved since then is quite prescient. Now, when you were talking about people adopting Bitcoin, it seems to me that education about best practices, best computer practices is very important. And I don't necessarily mean older people who maybe don't have much experience with computers. I mean, those younger people who are digital natives, but maybe have never been taught best practices. Now, what kind of best practices are necessary, Jimmy, for civilization if we're to go on a Bitcoin standard and all hold our Bitcoins ourselves on our hard wallets?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just sort of nailed it. The best practice is to hold it yourself, and most of the time, a hardware wallet will get you what you need. If it's a lot of money, you're probably going to want something like multi-sig and stuff like that. But it really depends on your situation, and it requires some education about how these things work, what a private key is, and what you're securing, and so on. Those things are going to take some time to go and learn. Everyone wants just sort of like a simple solution. And honestly, just get a hardware wallet and store it on there. That's a pretty good thing. And they have instructions and YouTube videos and things like that. It's probably good enough for most people. But if you really want to get into it and really secure your wealth, then I would suggest you learn about multi-sig and all the various features that these wallets have for that. And you're going to need to set up a coordinator and things of that nature. But yeah, it's not a simple topic, and you're going to have to level up your game. But as we said earlier, with great power comes great responsibility. And holding your own wealth means some level of responsibility.
Now, in terms of just the computer generally, Jimmy, like what do you think people need to know when they're hard wallet aside using their computer? What attack vectors do they need to be most aware of? So clicking on links comes to mind, for instance, for me. People are reaching out. I had an interesting kind of phishing attempt where a friend of mine had their Instagram hacked, and I received a message from them asking to like help vote for them in some contest, and that link, which I didn't click, would have been essentially I guess kind of the phishing attack. What do people need to know about those who maybe aren't into Bitcoin quite yet and use their computer every day, albeit without best security practices?
I mean, if you own more than zero, that's probably at least a start. That's the first thing I tell people is if you don't own any Bitcoin, like just go own some and go buy some on Cash App or something like that, just so you know. I would say like if you have a small amount of money, a phone wallet will do. You can download a bunch of them. I recommend Moon Wallet, MUUN. You can transfer Bitcoins over from a service to your phone, and then at that point you can sort of watch it, and it's your possession. They have a different backup scheme than the mnemonic seed words that most ones have, but you can go store that somewhere, and that's good enough to restore it on another phone should you lose your phone or something like that. So it's little things like that that you need to work on, and upgrade your knowledge on. But there's a lot of resources, a lot of videos. I've written a lot of articles. There's a ton of resources on like Swan Bitcoin and Financial. They're both very good companies with a lot of education materials that you can read on and up your game, essentially.
And of course, there's your book, Thank God for Bitcoin. You mentioned earlier some drama on the developer front. Can you kind of rehash that for us? And I want to dig a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, so there's a Covenants proposal called OpsCTV, and Covenants is it's this idea that you can send it somewhere where it's restricted. So if I send you some money on the condition that you can only send it to one of three places, something like that would be a covenant. Or you can only spend it after some period of time, and something happens. Those are what you would call covenants. A trust is a form of a covenant. You can only, spend according to what the trustees say are allowed, or something like that. And they want to enable some sort of covenants on Bitcoin, and there's many proposals. OpsCTV is one of them. That stands for Op Check Template Verify. There's other ones like any prev out and optx hash and op tap leap update verify and so many others. But what Jeremy's doing with OpsCTV is that he's trying to get the covenants conversation moving forward by doing something called speedy trial, which is to see if miners will support this particular soft fork. And he's doing it rather aggressively without really considering the other proposals and so on. So that's causing some consternation. And Michael Folkson in particular is very much upset at Jeremy for going down this route. And we're seeing what's going to happen with it, because the soft fork signaling period is apparently starting May 5th or so.
What are some of the major concerns? Like, what are the implications? And then also, like, what are the implications for like the politics of Bitcoin development currently?
Yeah, the main concern is that he's doing this without getting without like allowing the other covenant proposals any room. He's just sort of like front running them and going around the people that have problems with his proposal. And it seems like an end around. So there's a large number of users, I think, that are pretty upset about it and plan on resisting it. I personally don't think it has any chance of getting miner adoption, because the miner adoption would require 90% signaling. I don't think he has it. I'm not even sure if there will be even one miner that will be for it. I mean, maybe there will be, I don't know. But that's not going to be nearly enough. You need 90% signaling over a 2016 block period. So if that doesn't happen, then I don't know. I don't know where it goes from there. But this is the politically, I guess it's about consensus and how do you get consensus. I know Jeremy's been pretty frustrated at not knowing what consensus really means, and this is his way of just trying to force the conversation. I don't agree with it, but I see what he's trying to do. And yeah, it's previous soft forks like Taproot and Segwit had some controversy around them as well. But it was more or less agreed on by the technical community that this was a good thing to do. So we'll see where things are after the speedy trial stuff, because I have a feeling he's going to try it and it's not going to succeed. And then I think his proposal will probably be dead forever at that point. I don't know. We'll see.
Taproot was one of the least controversial, initiatives from the development team that I've seen ever, perhaps. Why was that?
Well, it wasn't. It was controversial because the activation method of lock in on timeout equals true or false was a really big deal, and there was a lot of disagreement. So there were people saying it should be lock in on timeout equals true or versus false. and giving, because the perception was then you're giving the miners a veto or something like that. And speedy trial was sort of like a compromise to see, okay, well, let's see where the miners are, and if they're all for it, then we don't have to have this discussion. Well, I mean, that discussion is going to have to be done now, probably with these covenant proposals. It's very possible that Bitcoin is ossified at this point, and we're not going to get any additional soft forks. And because there was so much controversy around Taproot, at least in the development circles, because of the how we were going to activate it, and that was there was a lot of passionate arguing from both sides about that. So I don't know. Like the actual technical piece of the features and stuff like that, that wasn't very controversial on Taproot. And really, honestly, it wasn't that controversial for SegWit either. But the method by which we activate it has been the big question over the last three soft forks. SegWit, it was, do the miners actually have a veto? With Taproot, it was, what should the default be? Should we give them the perception that they have a veto at all? And with this one, it's, like, if we get the miners on our side, is that enough? Or like, can users do something? So it really does always kind of come down to governance. And that seems to be the big controversy. Although, in this case, there are competing proposals for covenants, and that's something that, I think this one doesn't really take into account, and that in that sense, it's a little bit unprecedented.
What are your thoughts on technologies like Stacks, RSK, and Lightning?
Well, I think Stacks is a complete scam. I think RSK is pointless, and I think Lightning is awesome. I don't know, what do you want to know about each of them?
Well, I guess let's start with Lightning.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us about the significance of Lightning to the Bitcoin network, especially as it's met adoption over particularly the last year, but even further back, like a couple of years?
Yeah, and Lightning is great because it allows you to scale, and it gives you a lot more privacy. And we're seeing that right now on the network, where if you're doing a Lightning transaction, it's there's no on-chain footprint, so you don't know who it was sent to other than the two endpoints, and there's all sorts of privacy things in between. So even if it's routed over many nodes, you find out, hey, oh, okay, like this is actually, like, there's no real info that can get stored that easily about your transaction. So it gives you a lot more privacy. It's also a lot faster. And the adoption's been growing like crazy. So, a couple of years ago, I would sell my books at Bitcoin conferences, and I would do maybe one or two Lightning transactions a day. This most recent one, I went to one this past weekend. I think I sold half of mine with Lightning, maybe two on-chain transactions, the rest in cash. So, the adoption's definitely there, and people are very enthusiastic about using it. And it's, especially in places like El Salvador, it's very exciting to see.
What are your thoughts on the early results out of El Salvador?
I think it's been pretty awesome. The whole country is sort of lifting out of the fog of IMF oppression, as I like to call it. If you're familiar with the economics of these countries, the way they work is that they get these large loans from the IMF, which is essentially printed money from several countries, mostly the US. And then when they can't pay it back, their property is sold off to Western countries. So they end up losing a lot of wealth to these Western countries and sort of conquer from a monetary perspective. And countries like El Salvador have suffered quite a bit. You not only have a lot of trade imbalances and things like that, but the best and the brightest of that country go leave for America. In fact, even if you have any ambition at all, you'll go illegally work in the US as a day laborer. And if you think about it, that's probably the worst thing for that country, because it's a country that really needs infrastructure, that needs to build stuff. Instead, those people are coming to the U.S. and building homes here, or taking care of our lawns instead. I mean, it's let's just call it what it is. It's colonialism. It's everything like that, but in name. It's just done without a shot fired and using monetary incentives. And they're starting to get out from under that, because they're able to say no to the IMF because of Bitcoin, through the use of this volcano bond, which they're probably going to do in the next month or so. And using that, they can really invest in their own country and use their own money instead of the IMF's money. And if you know about the IMF, they put all sorts of restrictions on how you can spend the money that they lend you, which is why there's so much corruption in these developing countries. So they're getting out from under that curse, and you can kind of feel the energy there if you visit. There's like a lot of optimism, a lot of growth. Like you can see sewer systems being put in, roads being put in, and things like that, which for a long time there wasn't, just because the people at the top were more interested in grifting than actually improving the country. But because they've said no to the IMF, well, instead of the politicians satisfying the IMF, they're now having to satisfy the people. And what the people want is better infrastructure, more homes, like hospitals, stuff like that. And that's what they're investing in. And that's actually great for the country. There are businesses starting up. There are, like people from all over Latin America coming into El Salvador because they know there's opportunity. There are people that left El Salvador 20 years ago for the US that are coming back because they're saying, what? There's actual like projects that I can build at home and be with my family. Yeah, I'll do that instead of like living here in the US in a foreign country. So I see it as a profoundly good thing, and the energy there is palpable. I think a lot of other countries will copy it in the next 5 to 10 years, especially in the developing world, as they see the results that come out of El Salvador.
In order to be considered for an IMF loan, these nations have to implement austerity measures, often referred to as IMF economic medicine. And I think oftentimes there's quite a bit of nepotism involved with who is getting these loans at any given time. Why is RSK pointless?
Because I think Ethereum is pointless. They're basically trying to implement Ethereum stuff using Bitcoin, and I don't see anything useful coming out of Ethereum. So by extension, I don't see RSK being useful at all. I mean, just because you're doing the same things with Bitcoin doesn't actually mean that it's actually useful. Most of these projects are predicated on being able to print your own token anyway. And that's the economics of the whole thing, is that you can make any business model work when you're printing your own money. This is why I think Stacks is a scam, because they're printing their own tokens. And, you get a lot of Silicon Valley insiders that get a large number of these tokens for very cheap, and then they're paid to go and promote it. And they do with all their, like tech outlets, and they make it seem like super innovative or something. And really, it's a grift. It's a way to print your own money and make make lots of money that way. Yeah, I see RSK as pointless.
Any other comments on Stacks?
Besides that, it's a scam? No.
And then why did you call the book Thank God for Bitcoin?
Because it's the redemption of money. So the subtitle is The Creation, Corruption, and Redemption of Money. And the book goes into that arc, basically. It's how did we get here? Why is money the way it is? Because most people, especially if you're a Christian, look at money almost as a savior, and they worship money. So like one way I can tell this almost immediately is I'll ask a Christian couple, hey, when are you thinking about having kids? And oftentimes they'll say, well, we can't afford kids yet. So what are you actually telling me? That if you had money, that the money would take care of the kid? And it's not about you or God or anything else. and that sort of points to how we've become a society obsessed with money. And how did we get here? Well, we got here because money got corrupted. It's been debased. It's been changed. It's been put into, it's been controlled by the state, and there's inflation and fiat money and all of that stuff. That affects everyday things like our time preference. So the YOLO FOMO mentality, so popular among millennials today, is the result of monetary policy. A lot of the politics that we have, the politicization of everything, is the result of monetary policy. Because if you can control the monetary spigot, yeah, everything's going to matter. So you make everything political. Even in churches, the money rules everything, and that's really sad. But with Bitcoin, I think you can get money can be put in its proper place. Rather than as something to be worshipped, it can be seen as an actual tool for savings, which is, I think what it's most useful for. It's the ability to defer consumption and to save for tomorrow and make something better for tomorrow. And that's certainly something that Jesus teaches. All of the analogies in the Bible about salvation are in monetary terms. It's about debt and payment and forgiveness and redemption. Those are all monetary terms. And he puts it in those terms for a good reason. It's so that we can understand what's actually going on a spiritual level. So I think at a profound level, this is all very spiritual. And monetary oppression is spiritual oppression, which is why I think, El Salvador is getting such a blessing, because the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, these are all organizations that monetarily oppress people. And I think that really means that they are spiritually oppressing these people. And once you're out from under that, there's a lot of blessing to be had. And I think El Salvador is right for that.
Where can people find you, Jimmy?
They can find me on Twitter at Jimmy Song, and I have a newsletter, jimmysong.substack.com, and my website is programmingbitcoin.com.
We've had the honor and privilege of sitting down today with Jimmy Song. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for joining us today. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.